This is from Signs of the Times, May 27, 1880. Those who plead that great charity must be exercised toward the transgressors of God's commandments may see in this instance of God's retributive justice how he regards that charity that would cloak sin or shield those in iniquity. The ringleaders in this wickedness, without respect to friendship or kindred, were to be punished with death. Only those were slain who stood forth in bold defiance to vindicate their conduct, while those who repented of their sins and humbled themselves were spared. Some would call the prompt and decided measures taken a hard and severe spirit. Aaron, failing to stand up boldly for the right, his yielding to the strength of numbers, placed him with the majority. Aaron represents the cases of a large number composing our churches at the present day. They pass over sins existing in the church which grieve the Spirit of God. They are lax where order and principle are involved, because it is not pleasant to reprove and correct wrongs. They are themselves carried along with the current and become responsible for a fearful neglect of faithfulness. Moses represents a class who will call sin by its right name, a class that will give no place to sin or wrong, but will purge it from among them. Our abhorrence of sin cannot be too strong if we are controlled by no personal, selfish feelings. If we labor disinterestedly for the salvation of souls, pleading in behalf of the erring and those blinded by their own transgressions. We repeat the sin of Aaron, pacifying when the eyesight should be clear to discern evil, and state it plainly, even if it places us in an unpleasant position, because our motives may be misapprehended. We must not suffer wrong upon a brother or any soul with whom we are connected. This neglect to stand up firmly for truth was the sin of Aaron. Had he spoken the truth plainly, the golden calf would never have been made. The same spirit that led him to shun to declare the whole truth for fear of offending led him to act a falsehood in pointing to the golden calf as a representation of the one who brought them from Egypt. Thus, one unfaithfulness leads to another. In other words, Moses, the true peacemaker, came across as severe, strict, and harsh, but he had the welfare of Israel in mind, and he was trying to fix the problem at its source. Aaron, the pacifier, on the other hand, won the admiration of the people by his gentle, mild, patient, yielding spirit. But yet he was willing to let many people die and even try to throw the blame of his sin on them. So what does the Bible say is the way for us to obtain peace? Psalm 119, 165. Great peace have they which love thy law, and nothing shall offend them. In other words, renouncing sin and obeying God is the only way that we're going to have that great peace. Look at the history of Lot. Lot was more of a pacifier. He hesitated to obey the angel's warning and instruction, and in doing so, Lot killed his wife. Did you get that? Let me say it again. He hesitated to obey the angel's warning and instruction, and in doing so, Lot killed his wife. Patriarchs and Prophets 161. Again, the solemn command was given to hasten, for the fiery storm would be delayed but little longer. But one of the fugitives ventured to cast a look backward to the doomed city, and she became a monument of God's judgment. If Lot himself had manifested no hesitancy to obey the angel's warning, but had earnestly fled toward the mountains without one word of pleading or remonstrance, his wife would have also made her escape. The influence of his example would have saved her from the sin that sealed her doom. But his hesitancy and delay caused her to lightly regard the divine warning. While her body was upon the plain, her heart clung to Sodom, and she perished with it. Now, in contrast, we see Abraham, who was more of a peacemaker. Genesis 18:19. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him. And they shall keep the way of the Lord, and do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. So we see Abraham as a peacemaker, and Lot as a pacifier. And look where it got him. Look at the story of John the Baptist. At Herod's party, when Salome asked for John's head, what did Herod and his guests do? They held their peace. Look at this quote. Desire of Ages, page 221. Herod was astonished and confounded. The riotous mirth ceased, and an ominous silence settled down upon the scene of revelry. The king was horror-stricken at the thought of taking the life of John, yet his word was pledged, and he was unwilling to appear fickle or rash. The oath had been made in honor of his guests, and if one of them had offered a word against the fulfillment of his promise, he would gladly have spared the prophet. He gave them opportunity to speak in the prisoner's behalf. They had traveled long distances in order to hear the preaching of John, and they knew him to be a man without crime, a servant of God. But though shocked at the girl's demand, they were too besotted to interpose a remonstrance. No voice was raised to save the life of heaven's messenger. These men occupied high positions of trust in the nation, and upon them rested grave responsibilities. Yet they had given themselves up to feasting and drunkenness until the senses were benumbed. Their heads were turned with the giddy scene of music and dancing, and conscience lay dormant. By their silence, they pronounced the sentence of death upon the prophet of God, to satisfy the revenge of an abandoned woman. These are some pretty serious warnings to us today. When we're placed in a situation where we see something that's wrong taking place, if we see some sin being committed, or we see some error that's being preached and pushed on the people, are we to hold our peace? I thought this one was interesting. This is in Esther. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come into the kingdom for such a time as this? Signs of the Times, January 24, 1884. In the existing state of religious declension, there is crying need of earnest, faithful Nehemiahs and Ezras, men who will not shun to call sin by its right name, who will not shrink from vindicating the honor of God. Those upon whom God has laid the burden of his work are not to hold their peace and cover prevailing evils with a cloak of false charity. Men of courage and energy are needed to expose fashionable sins. Iniquity must not be palliated and excused. Those who lead the church of God to follow the customs and practices of the world are not to be lauded and exalted. No regard for family or position will hinder the faithful servants of Christ from guarding the interest of the people. God is no respecter of persons. Great light and special privileges bring increased responsibility. When those who have been favored or honored of God commit sin, their influence goes very far to encourage others in transgression. And if by their example the faith of another is weakened, and moral and religious principle is broken down, the wrath of God will surely come upon those betrayers of their sacred trust. Severity to a few will often prove mercy to many. Yet we must be careful to manifest the Spirit of Christ and not our own hasty, impetuous disposition. We must rebuke sin because we love God and love the souls for whom Christ died. You know, this makes me think of another event that happened a few years ago in a major city here in the United States. There was a man that attacked a woman in an alleyway among some high-rise apartment buildings. And he stabbed her repeatedly, and she kept screaming for help. And in those high-rise apartment buildings, all the people were hearing her screams. And over 100 people turned on their lights and stuck their head out the window to see what was going on. And when all the lights came on and all the people started sticking their heads out the window, the man got scared and he ran off. He fled the scene. And then all those people turned their lights back off and went back to bed. And the man came back and finished killing the woman. Not one person out of that 100 some odd people lifted a finger to help that woman. Nobody called 911. Nobody cared. Those people were all pacifiers. Oh, we don't want to get involved. We don't want to stir up more trouble. Somebody else will call 911. That man may have done the actual killing himself, but in the judgment, who's going to answer for that woman's blood? Ezekiel 3:17-19. Son of man, I have made thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word at my mouth, and give them warning from me. When I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way, to save his life, the same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thine hand. Yet if thou warn the wicked, and he turn not from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. So if we see error being promoted, if we see something wrong being sanctioned, we are required by God to stand up and protest. We must do everything in our power to counteract that error. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 578. God held Eli as a priest and judge of Israel accountable for the moral and religious standing of his people, and in a special sense for the character of his sons. He should first have attempted to restrain evil by mild measures, but if these did not avail, he should have subdued the wrong by the severest means. He incurred the Lord's displeasure by not reproving sin and executing justice upon the sinner. Those who have too little courage to reprove wrong, or who through indolence or lack of interest make no earnest effort to purify the family or the church of God, are held accountable for the evil that may result from their neglect of duty. We are just as responsible for evils that we might have checked in others by exercise of parental or pastoral authority as if the acts had been our own.